I'm going to get a beer too.
You say we'll be eavesdropped to the web just now. Should you? We've been eavesdropped on.
All right. Hello, everybody. Is it being recorded as well?
Yes.
Yeah. I'm going to get a beer then.
Hi. Come on. Thank you. And I meant to get the.
Hi.
Is it Seb? Are you giving talk? I've seen you give a talk before. That's how I reckon.
Yeah.
I'm
Afraid it's me again.
It's you again. Oh, I'm sure.
I hope so.
Again.
Well, hope it keeps you.
Yes.
At least you've got the pizza and the beer. What have we got here to choose from for drink-wise?
That's probably the best of lunch.
Thank you. I'll have one of them then. Well, that's your keys. You probably don't want to give them to me. So where do you need me to stand? What's the angle of here, I guess? Okay.
Okay, so yeah, it is an
Later, outlined your possible assistance on another project. We have a book, the book, which would benefit from the likes of you. Have a look at it.
It's internal or community?
Community. No. We'll talk, maybe we're not being recorded.
That'd be good. Did you get your submission into Java Zone?
Yeah, I think I'll just do a single, probably submit last year, but without joint speaker. Yes.
Not with Philip?
Nothing against Philip, I think I'll be fine on my own. It's probably easier on your own. Yeah, I need to work out whether or not I want to spend my one conference trip on Java Zone again, which was good, but I've been before now. So.
You should probably go to Java 1.
Yeah, I think the chance of getting accepted there fairly slim.
Oh. Well, I don't see why. Did you try Java 1?
I did last year.
Right. That's right. You gave me feedback about how I should have done my submission, and I didn't do that.
In fact, it was
Somebody else's feedback. Yeah.
Probably is now. I shall. So, well, how do you introduce Seb? This is Seb.
Hello.
Who will talk to us about BDD, Cucumber, and SpecFlow. I'll let you do the ones about the things you've written,
Okay.
things you've done.
Yeah, won't bother. Thank you. And there are people speaking down there, are they?
There are people
Virtual.
watching.
Virtual people. So
People watching.
So best behaviour, everybody, because
Who would like us to reposition the camera for streaming. Well, that's pretty good too.
okay. Well, I'll let Henry deal with the camera. So this is, it's a short presentation, about, somewhere between 40 and 50 minutes. I've given it a number of times before, and it's really trying to introduce BDD and put it in context, what it is, what it isn't, when it might be useful, some of the things that I've seen people try and do with the BDD label that is a really bad thing. So we'll see where we go. Before I start, can I get a feel for people here? How many people here would consider themselves to be product owners or business people? One, okay? Or 1.5 who's almost got a beer in their hand, okay? How many people are developers? Same sort of people, okay, and a few more. And QA or testers? Okay. So I guess, given that it's the Edinburgh community, Henry organised it, and it's in the NCR sort of space. I'm not surprised that we don't have that many testers. That's not typical. BDD, as you'll see as we go through, is a collaborative technique, which in essence demands testers, developers, and business folk, whether they are product owners, customers, BAs, or something of that ilk. I won't skip over technical stuff because clearly there's a lot of you here will be interested in that. You'll also see that I'm not very good at maths. So when I first proposed this talk, it was as I was getting onto a train, and I said, how about 10 things? Because that's one of those things that people do talks about. I couldn't squeeze it down to 10, so you'll see that I start at 0, which is helpful, a helpful little trick. That didn't work either. I ended at 11, but there you go. Life's like that. So I think before I start, it's really, certainly from my perspective, I think it's worth going through, giving a bit of background in BDD, because it came from somewhere, and it's got a bit of baggage that comes with it, and I think it certainly interests me, and it gives you a bit of context. So first thing to say is that BDD as a term was coined by a guy called Dan North. So he's an ex-ThoughtWorks guy working out of London. He'd spent a number of years trying to train developers in test-driven development. So lots of developers here. So how many of you work in a test-driven cycle? A few. Most. Okay, that's good. So as you'll know, the idea in TDD is you write a failing test, generally a fairly automated test. You make that test pass, and then you refactor while the tests stay green. And although about 50% of you put your hands up, I would suggest that 50% of the development industry don't work in a TDD fashion. I would suggest even that 50% of the developers in the UK don't even write unit tests on a regular basis, let alone write them first. And this was the same, or possibly even worse, 15 years ago when Dan started trying to teach people. And one of the first things he found was that as soon as you say the word test to a developer, they start saying it's not my job. That's what the test people are for. They do the testing. I just write the code, and then I throw it over the wall. And he was having a problem because everything about the environment that he was working in was forcing him to use the word test. And every time he used the word test, the developers just went, it's not for me then. Now, back in those days, he was working in a Java place, and he was working was probably Java 1.2 or something like that. And so he was using an early version of JUnit. And in Java, back in the early days, there were no annotations, and the early versions of JUnit looked at the name of a method to decide whether it was a test. So you had to write the word test into the method. So there was just no way to get around it. And he kept having these problems, and he was trying to find a way around them so that he could help the developers work in a better way, work in the TDD way, but without polluting their minds or frightening them with the word test. He started working with the word should in his mind, and he met up with a guy called Chris Matz, who's another London-based agile, influential agilist, and he is a BA. So there weren't many agile BAs. There still aren't that many agile BAs. Anyway, they were lucky enough to be at the same conference in the US, and they sat next to each other on the flight back, and they started talking about how to get people to think, to challenge requirements, not just to go, it's a requirement, so I'll do it, but to say, what are you trying to achieve? Is this the best way to do it? Are you sure? Are there exceptions? And so they started talking about the word should. And what Dan decided was, he said, well, the word should seems to, it's just a really small change from test to should, but let's try that out and see how it plays. And so he started on this product that he called JBehave, and he replaced, rather than looking for the word test like JUnit did, it looked for the word should, a very trivial change. And he was pleasantly surprised by what he saw. Now, JBehave is one of the first BDD tools that came out onto the market, and it's fair to say that the replacement of test with should is not the only thing that it did. It went a lot further, and Cucumbers carried on going in that direction. But that's the history, and that's where it started, because by using the word should, we're immediately saying we want to think about how the system is supposed to behave, rather than saying, I've been told how it's supposed to behave, all I'm going to try and do now is fix it and make sure it works like that. So it's a different mindset. We're challenging, we're exploring the requirements, rather than going, They've been carved on a tablet at the top of a mountain, and we brought them down, and now we just have to turn them into code. That was the start of Dan's journey through BDD, and after a bundle of years, someone asked him, how am I going to sell this to the business? And he came up with this extremely mouthy and hard to remember and hard to use definition of what BDD is. It does touch all, it ticks all the boxes, presses all the buttons, but at the same time, it's difficult to memorize, and I'm not sure it would actually help sell it to the business. But we will come back to it in a minute, because there's a couple of things I think about it that are important. So, on to point one, the first point, which is that BDD as an acronym came along in about 2003, 2004. There are other acronyms that play in the same space. So we've talked about TDD. There's also something called ATDD, which is Acceptance Test Driven Development. And more recently, Goico Ajik started talking about Specification By Example. And he went off and wrote a prize-winning book on the topic. And the thing is, when you get asked what's the difference between these things, people are encouraged, consultants especially, are encouraged to make up a reason. Why are they called different things? Well, we need to position them in different places in the marketplace so that we can talk about why they're different and why you should use this one that's my favorite rather than that one that's somebody else's favorite. Liz Keel, who in fact worked closely with Dan and is responsible for the first, actually when JBehave got shipped first time around, has got a very simple answer. There is no difference between them. It just happens that people have given them different names. And I think that's, for me, that's the best explanation. Let's not try and come up with spurious reasons for saying ATDD is different from BDD, which is different from Specification By Example. They're essentially in the same space, and we're going to cover that for pretty much the rest of the session. I possibly disagree with Liz on the subject of TDD, because I think whereas the other three acronyms deal with trying to communication between the whole of the community, so the technical and non-technical members of the product team, I think TDD is generally pretty exclusively the technical side of the teams that work on it, and almost always only the developers. That's a shame. I think that's a challenge, but in reality that seems to be the way it plays out. So all of these slides, or at least most of these slides, have got a link along the bottom which takes you back to source material. Liz Keel is a phenomenal writer. Does anyone here read fantasy novels? Spells and sorcery sort of stuff? Anyway, she's been writing, she's on book 2 of a series of that. I highly recommend it. So the second point is that BDD is not about tools. So I see companies, I go and visit clients on a regular basis, and they go, well, there's two things. One is they go, oh, we really want to do BDD because we want more test automation, which is a tool-based approach. BDD is about automating tests. And other former company and people that I frequently communicate with on Tinternet, they say things along the lines of, I'm using this framework or this tool, therefore I am doing BDD. I use the words given, when, then, therefore it's BDD. And that's just so not true. Or rather, that's so different interpretation from my interpretation of what it takes to do behavior-driven development. So because it's BDD, not test-driven development and not tool-driven development, it's about the behavior. So go back to what Dan said, this wonderful definition, and he does say very clearly in the first sentence that BDD is high automation. Which you could be forgiven for taking that phrase, that statement, and then expanding from that and going, well, Dan's talking about tools, therefore it must be important. I think the point is that at the core of behavior-driven development is collaboration, and at the core of that collaboration is thinking about concrete examples of how the system will behave. And the great thing about concrete examples is that they make really wonderful test cases. They're very good candidates for automated test cases, and therefore, as a side effect of doing the collaboration and focusing on examples, you get the opportunity to do high automation, automate loads of stuff. But it's not the essential bit. I think the essential bit starts earlier on, and I would ignore the second generation bit because, quite frankly, I don't know where he started counting. But outside in, is really important, that we're thinking about how the system's going to behave before we've written it. It's pool-based, which means they don't dump 200 pages of specifications on the development team and say, call us when you're finished. They bring us feature at a time, they bring us user story at a time, we refine the backlog. Multiple stakeholder, because we're not just going to be the development team working with it, we're not just the testers looking at it, we're the devs, the testers, and the business all working together. Multiple scale, because it doesn't just work small, it works at lots of different levels. And agile methodology, because we can respond to change. And so I think all of these things are really important. The high automation is a huge bonus. But I've seen organizations who have probably got 70% of the benefit out of the BDD approach without automating their test cases. Because I don't know what it's like here at NCR or the other organizations that you folk work at, but many places where I go to, the single biggest challenge to them ever delivering anything of any use to anybody is actually speaking to each other. They just don't do it. So Liz again put it in a different way. As I said, she's a good writer. So she says having the conversations is more important than capturing the conversations, which is more important than automating the conversations. So it's a value statement, an ordered, structured way of approaching BDD. Start by getting the right people talking to each other. Getting them to use the right language, get them to understand each other's point of view, get them to be open enough to challenge each other about their understanding. Once you've got that communication going, then start capturing the outcomes, start writing them down. If you have to, put them in a JIRA ticket or into TFS. If you're in a more lightweight paper-based system, write them on cards. Once you get to that point, now you've got the outputs that you can use as candidate test cases. Now you can automate them. So how many conversations do you have? How much discussion do you need to do? The answer is you need to get to a point where you really understand the problem. So as a developer, have you ever gone into, taken a story, someone in the grooming has gone, are you all happy with this? Are you ready to estimate on it? Team sits down, you do your estimations. A week later, you pull it off of the to-do pile and start working on it, and loads of questions come up. Oh, I hadn't thought about the interaction of those bits. How does it work with that API? What happens if they're not logged in? All sorts of questions like that. Does that feel like a place you've ever been? Yeah. That's because we didn't talk about it enough. We just heard the spec and we didn't really dig down. We only actually start exploring and discovering the complexity of a problem when we actually start thinking about using it. And so this is what the conversations are about. They're not about just sitting there chatting, going, "You happy with this? Do you like the wording? No, can you nod?" No, it's not about that. It's, can you think about exactly how we're going to use it? Can you come up with sets of data that will explore how this feature, how this part of the functionality is supposed to behave? And once you're happy, once you've got there, once you've nailed it with a set of examples that really illustrate how that feature is supposed to behave, then you can automate it, then the tools become really useful. So, I've mentioned the word collaboration many times already today. Collaboration is core to BDD. Do you recognize these two gentlemen? They are the Three Amigos, an appalling film, an appalling name that happens to have moved into the BDD canon, which is a great shame. There's a reason why people went for Three Amigos, and that's, as I described already, because we've found that you need to have someone that represents the business, you need to have someone that represents development, you need to have someone that represents test, because those are three perspectives on a piece of software that are entirely different, or at least wildly different perspectives. So that's where the number 3 came from. Three Amigos followed on because it is a comedy film. Those of you who are a little bit older might remember from the software world a Three Amigos that came before even these Three Amigos. Does anyone remember Object Orientation from the deep, dark 80s? There was Grady, Rumbo, and Booch who wrote the text on object orientation, and they were called the Three Amigos. So it turns out that whenever software people get three things, it becomes the Three Amigos. These days I try not to call it the Three Amigos because I find it distracts. First off, people say, does that mean there have to be exactly 3 people in the room? Do they have to be friends? And the answer is no, they don't have to be friends, and they don't have to be exactly 3. Sometimes you need other people, other experts in the room as well. You may be talking about a feature that requires someone from, I don't know, maybe you need an actuary as well as a business person because it's in a very technical area of insurance. Maybe you need a UX specialist. Maybe you need someone who can talk about security. So we're not limiting it to 3. They clearly don't need to be friends, but they do need to be in a room and discussing a particular piece of the functionality. Aslak is a Norwegian guy living in London these days, and he worked with Dan North at a high-frequency trading company called DRW. And this is where he got interested in BDD, and he wasn't a Java fan. And so he decided to try and do something a bit like JBehave, but do it for Ruby. And he called it Cucumber. And many years later, I think this is probably 9 years later, he then stepped back. He was hugely successful with open source tool, and then tried to tell people it's not a testing tool. It's a collaboration tool. So he's doing exactly the same job, trying to convince people that this tool which he's written and he loves and he thinks is really useful is only useful in the context of improving the communication between different stakeholders within the organization, specifically the technical and non-technical stakeholders. So this thing that I don't want to call the Three Amigos meeting or workshop at the center of the BDD process is really a place where we try and discover the examples that will illustrate and challenge the features that we've been given. So we call it a discovery workshop these days. And in this discovery workshop, we would like the business people, so whether it's the product owner or a customer, to come with us with candidate user stories. And as you know, a user story in the agile parlance is a placeholder for conversation. So it's not supposed to be detailed, it's supposed to be thought about. We would like our business people to know what they think they want from it, but not to be so committed to it that we can't have a discussion that everyone there can change their minds at. They come in with these user stories, and we have the discovery workshop, and at the discovery workshop, everybody comes up with concrete examples of how this user story may play out in reality. So we're thinking about, well, what happens if the network goes down? What happens if they're using diacritics as well as Roman text? What happens if they try and submit a string which is 10 characters long, but every character is a space? Are we going to strip off leading or trailing spaces? Are we going to check for rude words? All sorts of bits and pieces like that are concrete examples that when you're coding it up, you'd better think about it, but it'd be better to think about it early so that you can challenge your business people to tell you what the actual feature is that they want. And these examples, because they really do challenge the story, they do make you think about what is it that we're going to be doing when we implement it. They make the tester think about how are we going to test this, what are the validation rules. It gives us ideas. So maybe ideas is a weak way of describing it, but it actually says, is the rule, are the acceptance criteria which constrain the scope of this story, are they well enough defined? Have I actually thought about them? They ask you questions, is this story actually much bigger than we think it is? Could we split it into smaller concepts where we only need 4 or 5 examples for our first story, and the rest of the examples that we come up with that are very squarely within the same feature, maybe we can create a new story and defer that to a later iteration. So this process here allows us to challenge our understanding of the acceptance criteria, challenge our understanding of the story, and rewrite the story possibly in smaller chunks so that we can deliver smaller stories on a regular basis. The bit that excites many QA managers and software development managers in general is this secondary part, which is that these examples, as I said earlier, make great test cases. So now when you come out of this meeting, not only do the whole team have a much, much deeper understanding of what the problem is and an understanding of where the risks and the solution may lie, you also have some examples, concrete examples, which make great candidates for automated tests. Some of these will be acceptance tests, which you might code up in Cucumber or SpecFlow, and some of them will be unit tests, which will help you actually drive out the low-level code. The other thing that you have to think about with these discovery workshops is where would they fit into your typical agile process. So this is a standardized Scrum type process, and the simplistic way of fitting a discovery workshop into Scrum is to chuck it in here pretty much. Replace your backlog grooming with a discovery workshop and say that's a good one, job's done. And that's a Scrum way. You take your project manager and you call them a product owner. You take your developer and your tester and you call them a team member, and stand up every morning and have a cup of coffee, and that's you. You're agile. Well done. That doesn't work as well as people would like it to. So the first off is, do your backlog grooming sessions work well anyway? Do your sprint planning sessions work well? So I'll leave that as a hanging question. My experience is that frequently these can be sort of 4 hours, sometimes longer, where a team get together and are forced to estimate every story that's going to be in the next sprint. And my experience is that a 4-hour meeting is typically an unproductive meeting. You may get a lot done, but it's often worthless, it's extremely soul-destroying, and generally the thing that comes up in the retrospective is, I wish we had less meetings, or fewer meetings. So my preference is not to really bother with the backlog grooming as a big one big meeting, but actually schedule lots of small discovery workshops. Typically when I start with a team, I say, let's schedule half an hour every day. And every day we do half an hour. Half an hour just gives you time to think about one story. If you generate any questions that the product owner can't answer, that means it gives you time for them to go away and come back the next day or in 3 days' time with an answer to that question, where you can pick up where you left off. Half an hour is long enough for everyone to focus, and you actually, if you spend 10 days doing half an hour, you don't spend that much longer than a 4-hour meeting. So it's not wasting any extra time, and you're getting much more out of the team. So, Cucumber. I'm going to mention Cucumber here specifically, but actually this runs for SpecFlow and a lot of the other Cucumber flavors like Behat and Behave as well. So Cucumber is a really, really simple tool. It does hardly anything, and that's the way it should be, because all we're trying to do is give a framework for people to have a decent conversation and get those specifications requirements written. And the concepts are, your product's made up of features. And so what we want to do is we want to specify how each feature should actually work, how it should behave. And we do that in feature files. So this rectangle represents a feature file. There will be multiple feature files. Each feature file describes a feature. It's just a pure text file. You can actually have multiple feature files that describe the same feature. You might ask yourself, why would I want that? Well, because there are different stakeholders who need to be involved with a feature. So I mentioned actuaries earlier. So in the insurance domain, you may well have a feature file that gives an overview of an insurance product or a process within the business. And then when you dig down under the covers, there may be detailed parts of it that are more interesting of interest to different parts of the business or the non-technical stakeholders. So it may be a set of behaviors that is interesting to actuaries, a set of behaviors that are interesting to the marketing team, a set of behaviors that are interesting to customer services, and so forth. And so the feature file is a free-form documentation text file which allows you to partition your specifications so that you can direct it to the people who will be most interested in it. Each feature file is made up of one or more scenarios, and for scenario you can read example or test case. It's essentially one way that this feature may be used. And each scenario is made up of one or more steps, and a step is just a line of text written in the ubiquitous language, the business language, the language of the domain, a language that the team creates, the team understands, that helps them communicate unambiguously. And each step essentially describes one part of the process of how this example would be acted out if a person or another system was going to interact and drive the application. The steps will describe the context, as in how I would get to this part of the product. They will describe the action, which is how would the user or the other external actor actually interact with the system that we're building, and then it would describe the outcome, which is what happens as a result of this action and how would I verify that it had behaved correctly. And it would be written in a syntax known as gherkin. So one of the slight downsides of creating a product called Cucumber is that with the slightly limited imagination of the software community, that has led everyone into creating vegetable-based tooling. So we've got gherkin, we've got pickles, we've got turnip, we've got spinach. Anyway, so we can chortle and move on. It's a very simple syntax, and essentially it embodies the given, when, then way of writing things. So we've written our feature or features using this gherkin in the business language, and we would like it to drive out our application, hence the behaviour driven development. And so what we need is we need some way of gluing that English language, business language, through to an application that we haven't built yet. And so the Cucumber and SpecFlow tools provide this concept of glue code, and within the glue code we define step definitions. That is, we provide code which defines in the language, your language of choice, what should happen when each step is encountered while Cucumber is running. And these step definitions, like I said, are written in your language of choice. If you're going to be using Cucumber for Java, then it will be a Java step definition, or possibly Scala. If you're going to be doing it in using SpecFlow, it will probably be C#. If you're going to use Cucumber Ruby, it'll be Ruby. But it's just programming language. So what happens is a step gets read, and it finds the right step definition to execute. It calls that method, and then that method does whatever you want it to. So this is Cucumber. Cucumber literally is these two boxes. There is nothing else to Cucumber. There's obviously this application sitting on the outside that you want to drive or test, but Cucumber says nothing about how you interact with this. So quite a lot of people will be writing web pages, web apps, and they will drive this by putting Selenium WebDriver calls within their step definitions. But there's no need to do that. Cucumber itself doesn't know anything about Selenium WebDriver. This could be a REST API, and this might use Jersey client to package up requests and bundle them off, or put JSON into web service endpoints. Or this, maybe you're using Cucumber for Java and you've written your step definition in Java. Well, maybe this is actually a class library within your application that's being called. So Cucumber and SpecFlow don't care how you interact with this application. They have nothing to say about that at all. It's entirely up to how you write your step definitions. And it's entirely appropriate for you to interact with the application at a low level, as if it was just talking to classes or components, at a slightly higher level where you're hitting an API of one sort or another, and it's entirely appropriate also to write some tests end-to-end, going in through whatever UI you've got and diving all the way through to whatever back-end services you might need. But Cucumber's in here, and everything else is up to you. These scenarios, as I said earlier, are the examples or the test cases that we discovered in our discovery workshop. This is an example of a feature file, very cut down feature file. As you see, it starts with a keyword feature. You then get a place to write the name of the feature or some sort of text that describes it. Between the feature keyword and the first scenario, you've got a space for writing any text that you like, just free-form documentation. And what we typically put in there is the acceptance criteria or the rules that are satisfied or illustrated and explored by the scenarios that will follow in the rest of the feature file. Then you get your first scenario keyword, and again, some text to describe the name or what's going on in this example, why it's there. So I don't know, have you ever read a test and you wondered why did the developer write this test? I know I have. And this is a place where you can put a sentence which describes why that test is there. And then this one has two steps. Each step is introduced by keyword, given and then in this case. So we actually have a context and an outcome. You could replace this with when, and have a when, which is an action followed by an outcome. Again, Cucumber is not fussy about this. It's about semantics. It's about being meaningful to your team. You're trying to write readable documentation specifically that your product owner is going to be able to read and give you feedback on and go, yes, that's how I expect the system to work. This is a text file. So they typically have a .feature extension, but you can edit them in, Notepad if you want to. It's not so much fun doing it in Word, I would say, but Notepad will work fine. And then what you do is you point Cucumber or SpecFlow at the feature file, and essentially it reads each scenario, and it then tries to call the code that's associated with each of these steps, and it colors the text. That's the most magic bit. The text will go green if the if the test steps pass, and then it will go red if it fails. I mean, it's a very simple coding scheme, color scheme rather. Most people can code with it. What happens when it goes red, this is not shown on this slide because it's just a very abbreviated notation, is when it goes red, it will actually also print out an error telling you why it went red. Did it throw an exception? Did it try and compare the number 42 with 54 and find it wasn't equal? It will tell you why it failed. And there are several reasons why it could have failed. It could have failed because you haven't implemented this part of the code yet. So you're driving it out using this acceptance test. It could have failed because you've introduced a defect, in which case you need to go back and fix it before you check it in. Or it could have failed because the specification or the functionality of your application has evolved and now this documentation is out of date. And all three of these things are useful as useful feedback. But red is not necessarily bad. Red is just information for you as a development team to decide what to do next. So how do we connect from the step to the step definition? So this is Ruby. I show it not because excuse me, not because I think you should work in Ruby, but because it's suitably terse. And it does it through the power of regular expressions. So in Ruby, anything between forward slashes is considered to be a regular expression. And there this is trying to match the text, I register a team. You'll know that the caret stands for the beginning of a fragment, and the dollar is for the end of the fragment. And so essentially it's saying, I want to match the whole of the step with I register a team. And then it will call whatever code is written in that method or in that block. So this is Ruby. It's suitably terse. This is Java. It's somewhat less terse. You get your boilerplate, but you get the same stuff in the middle, which is a regular expression. In this particular case, because it's Java, it's represented as a string, but you get exactly the same caret and dollar sign. And then in C#, this is SpecFlow. Again, no regular expressions as such. You've got I register a team like this. You'll notice that in SpecFlow, it doesn't have a caret and it doesn't have a dollar, because SpecFlow assumes that that's going to be the case. That's about the only difference at that level. Essentially, all that's going on here is that Cucumber and SpecFlow are using regular expressions to try and match between plain text, ubiquitous language, business readable, feature scenario, through to actual executable code that should get called. And
is that being written by hand by the developer, or is
so this bit will be generated, but it doesn't do anything. All it does is tell you that you haven't done it yet. What it does do is it generates this regular expression, and that's both a boon and a disaster, because it's been given to you by the tool, and then people go, oh, it must be right then, which is not correct. So these things, when this is generated like this, it's called a snippet, and pretty much all the Cucumber flavors generate snippets. Trouble is that it's just trying to guess what you were intending by your sentence, and the regular expression that it generates may not be appropriate for your needs. So the snippet is nice because you can copy it off the console and paste it into your step definition class, but in reality you need to look at it and see whether it meets your needs. Equally, some of these, you can also specify that some of these are parameters. So it will pass integers through from the step to the step definition, and it will give them meaningful parameter names like P0 and P1. And this is not in the spirit of good documentation. So you absolutely need to go and edit this. But yes, it will generate some for you. At this point, I don't know, are there C#.NET developers here? And do we have Java, Ruby type developers as well? Okay, so I'm going to just call out a few of the fundamental differences between SpecFlow and the Cucumber family. Because they're not, although Gaspar, who used to work at Tech Talk, is now working closely with the Cucumber folk, they didn't start off in the same place, and there are significant differences. First is that in the Cucumber family, given, when, then, they're keywords, but they don't signify anything semantically. So given I register a team will match exactly the same step definition as when I register a team, and maybe bizarrely as then I register a team. It just does this, it calls the same code. It's the regular expressions get stored in the same namespace, and Cucumber doesn't look at that keyword. In SpecFlow, it's entirely different. given namespace, when namespace, then namespace. And these two ways of thinking there's a culture clash. Within SpecFlow, they did introduce at one point step definition to mimic the behavior of Cucumber. I was at a meeting of Cucumber folk last weekend, and it's possible that Cucumber might move in the other direction as well. So we might end up with, you can choose as a user. But at the moment, this is a significant difference. As your application grows, you will end up with lots of feature files, but you'll also end up with lots of step definition files. And the step definition files, typically the step definition files are organized on a per domain and concept basis. So if you've got a customer, you'll have a step definition file with all the steps to do with interacting with customers. If you've got an account, you'll have a step definition file with all the step definitions that interact with accounts, and so on and so forth. And of course, when you have multiple step definition files, there's some bits of data that need to be shared across those step definition files. Like which customer logged in, or what day of the week it is, or what account has been opened. And sharing that data, we're experienced developers. It's easy to share data. Trouble is that within a test, within a suite of tests, you would like each of those tests, each of those scenarios, to be isolated from every other scenario in that suite of tests. So you wouldn't want scenario A to depend on scenario B or vice versa. You wouldn't want the outcome to leak across scenario boundaries. So if you're trying to share data using, God forbid it, singletons or statics, you've now got an issue about how am I going to make sure that I don't let any state leak between these scenarios. And all of the Cucumber and SpecFlow tools provide a mechanism in which the tool itself enforces a lifecycle boundary between scenarios. So Ruby introduces the concept of a world object. And so if you have data that you want to share between step definitions, you bung it into the world object, and Cucumber guarantees to destroy the world object at the end of the scenario. And you have to start again and build up your context, thus helping you ensure that state doesn't leak between scenarios. Java, being idiomatically different, uses dependency injection, where you tell Cucumber that you would like it to inject a shared object into the step definition, and it does so for you. At the end of the scenario, it will delete that object, and you'll start again building up your context from fresh. SpecFlow, as always, does all the things that you could possibly want and more, and it gives you many different scopes. It's not just around the scenario scope. It will give you data that is shared across features and only cleaned up at the end of each feature. But essentially, all of them do things in slightly different ways, although they're achieving the same end. And then finally, the last one I'm going to cover is something called hooks. So the feature file is specifically designed for sharing between technical and non-technical members of the team. Yet there are some things when you're running tests or applications that are highly technical that you need to do, but that your business folk neither need to be aware of nor want to be aware of, such as maybe you need to spin up a web server or truncate a database table or something to just get the context of the application to the state that you need for the scenario to start. And so what Cucumber and SpecFlow provide is something called hooks. They're written just like step definitions in the glue code, but they get invoked directly by SpecFlow or Cucumber at various places in the scenario lifecycle. So the only that are truly common among all the implementations are called before and after, and the before hook is called before a scenario starts, and the after hook is called after a scenario ends. So you can do setup and teardown. So documentation. Have you ever come across system documentation that's ever even slightly out of date? Has anyone ever read a comment that doesn't apply to the code that it seems to be commenting? So the trouble with textual documentation is that there's nothing, only discipline will keep it up to date. And we don't have much of that. So this concept of living documentation has been described. It's also sometimes called executable specification. It's where the documentation itself actually invokes the application and asserts that the application does what it expects. And this is where this is where the feature file is. This is living documentation, because says what the feature is, it says how this feature is supposed to behave. When you tell Cucumber or SpecFlow to process this feature file, it will execute the application. And as I showed earlier, it will color it red or green. In the process of getting to this feature file, we've created a number of artifacts. Now, I've shown them on index cards because that's my preferred way of working, but equally you might have done it in Jira or in TFS or one of the other tools that's available. And the things that as Agile practitioners will be used to working with is user stories, which frequently on the reverse or separate cards will have one or more acceptance criteria, which define what the business would like to see for them to say that the user story has been delivered. And the discovery workshop that I described earlier will generate these examples. Then the examples will be data points that illustrate how this acceptance criteria is going to function within the context or within the scope of the user story that we're talking about. So we've generated all these artifacts. What do we do with them? Given that this is living documentation, and this is very much dead tree type documentation that can go out of date. So the first thing to notice is that, as I said earlier, these examples make great candidate tests, whether they're scenarios or unit tests. Nonetheless, you can document the system simply by translating them into either scenarios or unit tests. So we can get rid of the examples as soon as we've finished implementing them because we've captured them elsewhere. And this, of course, because it's a text file, has been checked into source control next to your code. The acceptance criteria, I recommend we document them up here. As I said, this gives you a nice handy hint as to what rules have been implemented by you so far in developing the software. This does have a weakness in that this is still just text, so this can get outdated. This is the main point of weakness I would suggest at the moment in the system. And we have plans, in fact, to enhance that in the coming weeks and months. But as it is just now, it's just taking the acceptance criteria which you've agreed with your business and documenting it in the feature file, where at least it gets checked into source control next to the code so you can read it and compare. So these also can disappear. And then finally, the one that I think the Agile teams find it hardest to deal with is the user story. Where does a user story fit into this pattern? And the answer is it doesn't. So what is a user story? A user story, is it a requirement?
Isn't it a feature?
Isn't it a feature? So that's one. So that's a theory that a lot of people work with. Well, I'm going to say it's absolutely not a feature. So in my book, certainly in the way I work, a user story is an instrument of planning. It's for defining a very thin product increment that we can deliver independently and then have validated. And over time, we tend to start off with very lightweight, low fidelity stories that we enhance or replace or refine with each iteration. We layer something on top of it. So a story that was delivered and successful and met all its acceptance criteria in iterations 1, by iteration 5, that piece of functionality might have changed completely as we've read in validation, moved it to different pages, changed the way that the flow goes through. So this user story, I would suggest, is transient. And so there's no place for it in the feature file. And if it was a card, then what I would do, the worst, what we do at the end of a sprint, is we bundle them up in elastic bands and put them in a drawer, never to be looked at again. In Jira world or TFS world, they happen to live on forever. But I suggest we try and forget about them. One of the worst things that I've seen people do is to try and associate a scenario with a story. Because as stories come and iterate over the application and build your functionality out, the previous stories become meaningless and distracting. Whereas the feature, the examples, because it's living documentation, because it runs against your application, continually document and demonstrate what the application is supposed to do. And having just dissed all of the things in Jira and on cards, it's necessary to say that doesn't mean that I believe that a feature file is all the documentation you ever need. It documents how the system works. It can make good user documentation, but there's other stuff. There's stuff that you'll need for installing it. There's stuff you'll need for maintaining it and troubleshooting it. There may be stuff you need for your regulator around system diagrams and showing due diligence, and many other forms of documentation. One of the common misconceptions is that because BDD is about automation, that means that if we successfully implement BDD, we can fire all of our testers. This is just not true at all. So BDD requires testers at the discovery workshop because it's a skilled mindset and approach which developers and product owners don't have. But equally, there's other forms of testing apart from those that we can automate. So some of you may be familiar with the testing pyramid. And the testing pyramid essentially is it's a metaphor, and it's trying to say that we want that our foundation of our testing strategy should be a lot of very small automated tests. So as we go up the pyramid, each of the tests exercises more and more of the application stack. So down here, it's testing a method or a class or a small component or set of components. As we go up, we start testing how those components work together. We're looking at the integrations and the protocols that bind our components together. And by the time we get to the pinnacle, we're doing end-to-end testing. We're checking that the system flows properly, that we've set up our database access correctly, that the firewalls in particular environments are pointing in the right places, etc., etc. But you'll notice this bit here at the top. We never get away from the need to have skilled professionals exercise our application and try and break it, because we only think of so much when we're sitting in a discovery workshop. So exploratory testing, which is an agile technique that's been documented quite a lot over the past 10 years or so, no one's found a way of automating it, and I think it's unlikely they ever will. And equally, there are some manual tests that are just too expensive to try and automate because they require levels of perception that we haven't yet coded up in our tools. This is the agile testing quadrant that comes from Brian Marek, and this particular version was done by Lisa Crispin and Janet Gregory. And as you see, there's a couple of bits on this side that are talking about automation, but there's stuff over on this side which are entirely manual at the moment. Some of these are to do with specialized areas where you have to have skills to operate tooling, and some of it's because we just need the perception of a human being with the necessary skills to do it effectively. So, unfortunately, having said that it's really important to have testers involved, what you then often find is people swinging in the other direction, going, oh, well, but does that mean BDD is just for testers? So you sometimes say, oh, well, BDD, that would be fine if our testers can do it, because we don't want them to take away from our developers' time because they're far too important to do any testing. So we've gone full circle back into this fallacy that all developers ever do is write code, and that's how they can be most efficient. So you remember this layout that we showed earlier, and there are development shops where they would like nothing more than say, well, you know what, we would like our testers to write these step definitions. Can't you make it easier for them to do that? And the answer is, well, no, this is writing code. So what anybody who's tried to use a test automation tool will find out is that actually it comes down to development skills in the end. So it's not to say testers can't do it, but if a tester is going to do it, they need to be a tester that has some development skills. Because the way we end up structuring this is not just knocking out really hideous code in here or repeating ourselves over and over again. We need to structure it just like we would structure any code, because it's got to be maintainable. Our application is going to develop and evolve over time. And what we frequently see is that actually we start building up libraries of support code. So these step definitions remain really thin, and they use shared bodies of code that will then allow them to interact cheaply with the application. So we may use data object builders or object mother patterns in here to try and set up in-memory mock data in an effective way. We're certainly going to be trying to remove duplication and factor our methods into small components that can be reused easily. And this is, I'm not saying that it's highly difficult stuff, but it is stuff that needs development skills. It's really good if your test professionals would like to up their development skills. This is a great place to pair between developers and testers to start building that level of expertise. But to think that BDD is going to be enacted entirely by the test department is just plain is plain misguided. And although the technical reasons are significant, and that's certainly one of the reasons why you wouldn't want to just say testers go away and write these step definitions, the other is that we're trying to create a shared language so that the feature files that are written express unambiguously the business domain, so that the business folk, the product owner, can give us feedback on our scenarios, and so that the developers can really understand the problem space they're trying to write the solution in, as well as the testers understand what the developers should have achieved by the time they say it's code complete. And if you just have the testers doing all of this on their own, then this ubiquitous language quite often doesn't hit that mark, because we're not getting the full feedback loop, we're not getting the input from the other stakeholders. How detailed should these scenarios be? So written the feature files, we can think of lots of different features, we can think of lots of different examples. What should go in them? Do I have to talk about every field on the page? Do I have to talk about every argument in the API? Should I be writing at a very high level of detail? And these are tricky questions. And the answer is always, I'm afraid it's always going to be, it depends. But what it depends on is who's going to read them. So the point of readable documentation is that it gets read. If you're going to write stuff that no one ever reads, don't use Cucumber or SpecFlow, because you will put in a significant amount of effort to write up these feature files and these scenarios, code up the step definition glue, and generally get it into a place where someone could read it. And then if you've written the feature files in a way that is not of interest to your product owner, they never will read it, you'll never get feedback, you've just wasted a lot of effort. So we've found that what we need to do is avoid incidental details. So the example that we frequently use is a login page, registering for an account. And here's an example of it. I know it's very small, but essentially it's a scenario that's called new user redirected to their own page. And it talks about not logged in, visit home page, follow a sign up link, fill in a field called username with a name called Matt. You fill in a field called password with password, confirm password with password, click the sign up button. So you can see where this is going. This is very, very imperative. It's telling you exactly how you're interacting with a single UI. It's telling you that in great detail. It's okay to see one scenario like this. Can you imagine reading 30 scenarios like this? It'd be grim. And yet there's lots of different behaviors going on that will all require you to log in and create a new account. This is just one that's talking about being redirected to your own page. And if the UI changes, and maybe on some platforms we're not doing confirm password, but instead we're using fingerprint detection, that's going to be tedious as well, because we've really pinned down the UI here. So you can rework this and make it look, to my mind, a lot more readable, a lot less imperative, with a lot fewer incidental details. So most of the stuff that we saw on the previous page is now encapsulated in this statement when I sign up for a new account. Now, clearly, at some point we're going to have to define what signing up for a new account actually means. We'll probably have done this in an earlier, very detailed scenario. But this will suffice for all the other scenarios that require you to explore behaviors that surround signing up for a new account. So this is much more declarative, and it contains no incidental details. Again, going back to Dan North wrote an article about this back in 2011, and he says that if you find it hard to condense your imperative multi-step detailed scenarios down to something that's more declarative at a higher level, it's probably because you're missing out on a domain abstraction. So the domain abstraction that we got here is signing up for an account. And so now we can collapse all of these detailed steps into a domain abstraction of signing up for the account. This is my obligatory call out to CyberDojo. Any new skill takes time and practice to get good at. And using Cucumber and SpecFlow is no different. CyberDojo is a tremendous development environment that Henry hates, but nonetheless, I find extremely valuable and useful. It's a development environment that has many languages already installed. It's on the web, so you don't have to install anything yourself. It allows you to run dojos, so groups of people working not on the same code, but in the same problem, and then you can, at the end of the dojo, compare how each group or each person got to their solution, thus benefiting from the shared learning and the shared experience. There's a number of different languages. There's, I think, 30 or 40 languages you can choose from. And once you choose the language, you can then choose which testing framework to work with. This is a tool not about the language itself, it's a tool about learning how to do test-driven or behavior-driven development using these tools. So in C#, it allows you to choose SpecFlow. If you're going to use Java, it allows you to use Cucumber, and likewise with Ruby. So it's pre-installed, you don't have to download anything, and you can get started straight away. And Henry will show it to you later. Then the final bit that I wanted to say, we're on point 11, is that here in Edinburgh, on May the 24th, XP 2016, which is the longest running Agile conference, is coming to Edinburgh. First time in Scotland, only the second time in the UK in its 17-year history. There's these names that are scrolling along the bottom. I don't know whether you can see them, but they're all available on the web, and they are, just the cream of the development and Agile community. So if there's any way you can be just up the road between the 24th and 27th of May, I heartily recommend it. I mean, I am involved with the conference, so I'm partisan, but nonetheless, it really will be a good conference. And we're also doing lots of fun social things, like we've got hired Edinburgh Castle for the party. So before we get to Henry again, we'll move on, maybe, or it won't let me. Henry, what did you do?
Just waiting for my name.
Okay, well, it'll come there. It's coming after Woody. There you go. Still won't let me. What have I done? I'll have to do something here, possibly. Yes, we do. So, having promised 10 and giving you 12 things, I'm going to do it again, this time in binary. I'm going to give you 10 things, base 2, to take away. The first is that BDD demands collaboration. It's not about the tools, it's not about given when then, it's not about things going green. It's about business, as in product owner, development and QA or test, getting together to really dig into the specifications, into the user stories before we try and work on them, so that we unearth the unknown unknowns and the hidden assumptions early on. And 1.0, which is the other one, is that examples facilitate feedback. The concrete examples are the powerhouse at the center of BDD. They are what make us focus on the rules and focus on the story and really force us to understand what those stories and what those acceptance criteria require. As Henry said, I will mention that if you're interested in Cucumber for Java, somebody wrote an excellent book on the subject, and which you can buy online.
I'll also say that it's the best book about Cucumber for Java I've ever read.
There you go. And he did read it, though, which is it's also the only book you've ever read.
Not the only book. But
Yeah, almost. I almost worked there. So thank you very much for coming along. If you've got any questions, I could either take them just now or, yep, Mike.
So, Seb, in your experience, how often are feature files revisited by business people after the feature has been implemented?
So that's very dependent on the organisation. In the organisations where they're not revisited, it dies, and people aren't doing BDD, they're just doing test automation. But in most organisations, because the feature file is evolving, it doesn't stay static, it doesn't stay unchanged. The business people visit the feature file as it gets authored, it gets reviewed, and they give you review comments. Now there's a separate part of the process which I haven't really talked about, which is publishing the feature files after they've gone into the CI pipeline. So Cucumber and SpecFlow both have plugins that produce different forms of output. And one of the useful forms of output is the HTML output, which then you can publish on your local intranet, which allows people to browse the functionality of the application. And that is very useful. It's a bit rudimentary at the moment, has to be said. But one of my colleagues, Matt Wynn, has got a tool called Relish, which allows publishing it in a much tidier and neater HTML markup, and forward-looking, exciting companies like the British government are using that to document the way they're working. So there are many companies that are using these feature files after they get authored. Hey.
Do you recommend writing the given when then specifications in the discovery workshops? Is it going to kind of sketch?
Yeah, so that is a great question, and that's something that we do differently at different clients. So one of our major clients at the moment, they are finding that they don't have the product owners don't have the time to devote to doing that in the workshop. So what we've found has worked better is that at the workshop we capture the examples. If they're simple examples, we capture them as what we call rough examples with just a placeholder. So we use what we call the Friends naming scheme. Friends being the not the Amigos, but the American soap or sitcom from a number of decades ago. So it's an example, the one where the customer forgot their receipt, something like that. If they're more detailed areas and we want to really dig into, then we actually capture the data elements, the context, the action, and the outcome on the cards. And then after the discovery workshop, in this particular customer anyway, what we do is we have the development and testers collaborate in authoring the given when then, and then that goes back to the business for feedback and to complete that feedback loop. Did someone over on this side want to? Yeah.
Yeah, I was interested in the idea of domain abstraction and trying to keep the definitions concise, so not getting like completely crazy and scare everybody off.
Yeah.
Stakeholders got one and a half or really long document.
Yeah.
But you kind of said that you would somewhere kind of specify in a bit more detail that what that abstraction is, what it means to
Yeah.
log in. Is that kind of hidden somewhere else? Or?
No, it's not hidden. So like I said earlier, we have different feature files for different audiences.
Yeah.
And so your UX or your security people are really going to be interested in what fields are there, what links are we going to click, did you have to confirm the password. That particular one, we've worked on, not surprisingly, pretty much every system has got register an account and create a login. So we've done this a zillion times. And so there are intermediate scenarios that we find ourselves writing about the customer providing an acceptable username and providing an acceptable password. And so we get to something that's slightly more detailed. And then elsewhere we go into real detail about what constitutes valid usernames. So are you allowed spaces in them? Are they case sensitive? What character sets do they accept? And same with passwords. Do they have to be more than 8 characters long? And all of these things need to be specified somewhere. Now, it may not be appropriate for some of these details to be expressed in a feature file at all. Maybe some of these things live quite rightly in a unit test suite that only developers see. But actually, a lot of the detail that you might think that nobody in the non-technical sphere is interested in, actually there are people that are interested in it. And it becomes a question of how do we partition these features so that the right person can get to the stuff that's of interest in them quickly and not be burdened by reading through reams of detail that quite frankly, they're not interested in.
I think, yeah, that's not so much possible. People would be interested, business people would be interested in that little bit. It's more about when they're looking for something else.
Yeah, so I mean that I have to admit there's work to be done there. I mean we are doing this work at the moment to make it easier to index and organize the feature files in a searchable way that mirrors my understanding of how structured documentation works best. So essentially high level stuff, and if you're interested you drill down and see more detailed low level stuff underneath it. So fast, easy to find.
Do you get much pushback from like the in kind of way of specifying scenarios? It occurs to me that just to a certain extent, part of the tester's job, and part of the developer's job is thinking in that way, thinking through the details of how things like scenarios. The code wasn't there for you to do.
Yeah.
And I kind of wonder whether think that hard about it. You know, everyone's funding what your experience was.
Yes, so my experience is that they would love to be able to go, here's the requirement, go away and tell me when you're done.
Yeah.
But they also would love you to deliver the product that they want on time and on budget. And you don't do that when it works like that, because if they hadn't answered the question, then and you get into the detail of it, you've got two choices. One is to guess, and the other is to go back and ask them anyway. And both of those are more expensive than asking them in the first place. So yeah, there is pushback, but you push back on the pushback. That's how to do it, yeah.
This kind of relates to the question, but I've worked in places where they think, well, the hope is that using BDD eventually, the business analysts will just be writing BDD in that communication method. Do you think that end state is achievable or misguided?
Misguided, entirely misguided. So the collaboration is the core of BDD. You can write, whether you write your requirements using doors and, structured requirements using should and must and chainable links that you can follow, or whether you write it using given, when, then, if it's one person with, or one group of people with a single responsibility using it as a one-way communication mechanism, it's going to be just as prone to miscommunication and misunderstanding as any other. Great. Oh, yeah.
In your experience, when you take this into organisations that have a more traditional approach to testing, where do you find the challenges?
Well, that's a big question. Yeah, because the traditional organisations that you're describing have challenges not just around trying to adopt BDD. They have challenges around finding test environments. They've got legacy code that has no affordances for doing testing of any sort anyway. So it's all the same transformation. It's in the same transformation bundle. This is not. It's not a silver bullet. It's not a source that you add to an organisation. It's a tool by which you change the way the organisation works. And I think a lot of our clients, we say this to them, but they still think it's just going to be a question of bringing in Cucumber. So I would say that a lot of people drop out after the first couple of trial experiments. Some succeed massively and have really large, large many-year projects to train people and then coach them through the modifications and change the way the organisation is structured. But yeah, it's not straightforward. Sorry.
So when it comes to the glue code, once again, in your experience, do you typically see there a level end-to-end tests? Or do you also see, as you mentioned, unit integration tests? What's more typical in your experience?
Well, so with the organizations that have legacy code bases that they're trying to retrofit any form of test automation on, you always see a tendency to do far too many end-to-end tests at the top. And you'll get all sorts of excuses and reasons for that, all of which are perfectly valid. But the trouble is that if you invert that testing pyramid and you get what's laughably called the ice cream cone anti-pattern, where you've got huge amounts of UI tests and very few unit tests. The problem that you get there is that the tests, they're slow typically because they have to use the old application. They're brittle because if anything changes, something in that test is going to break and you're never quite sure what caused it to break, so it's hard to diagnose. And you also get massive problems with test data. These are the sort of organizations to run the tests, you have got to have specific named customers with particular products in particular states to be able to exercise a particular behavior. And it all just becomes really problematic. So again, it's another question of working effectively with legacy code, going in there and trying to refactor the legacy applications so that you can test smaller slices of it, and then you can start pushing the test down from the pinnacle of the pyramid further down towards the base of the pyramid. And that again is a challenge, and yet one that when companies succeed at it, they get vast amounts of value. Expensive.
But that is a valid strategy, starting with that and very driven.
Well,
anti-pattern or problematic?
no, it's definitely problematic as an anti-pattern. My preference would be to find a particular piece of the code where you would get value straight away from doing some refactoring, applying some of Michael Feathers' patterns to get seams in place, and then testing the hell out of it. Yeah, because once you, so has anyone looked at manual test scripts in HP Quality Center or something like that? They've been sitting there, they're this long, they've got a name at the top, no one's quite sure why all these steps are there, what's it supposed to test. And if you start at the top, actually, that's exactly what you end up with. It's just you get it written in Selenium or some other test automation package, because it becomes so expensive to run these tests, and you end up with test suites that run into days over elapsed time. They get so expensive that rather than create a new one to test a different behavior, people will try and bundle a different behavior into the same test. So now it gets longer and more convoluted, and if it fails early on, then you're never sure whether the other bits would have passed. Just, no, definitely not a great place to start, and it's not, we specifically discourage it. Great, thank you very much, folks. Oh.
What? Question or well, I don't know. Should we do the applause again then?
Thank you.
Particularly thank you for putting my name up there with Michael Feathers and Nat Ice, and I'm sure you'll leave it there.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep. The next Michael Feathers.
So, thank you again.
Thanks.